Attention, attention, this is History Lost in Time. And welcome to episode 71 of the History Lost in Time podcast. This podcast is available in German and English and can be found on YouTube, Spotify, Podcast.de, Blue Sky and Instagram. There's also a music-based partner project on YouTube called HLIT AI Music. The topic of this episode. This episode is about the Deutschland-class armored ships, the Admiral Graf Spee, the Admiral Scheer and the Deutschland, which was renamed Lützow during World War II. Technically, these aren't battleships, so they don't quite fit into this series about battleships, but they aren't really battlecruisers or heavy cruisers either. I'm including them in the battleship category anyway, because 1. With their 28cm guns, they had battleship-like armament, even if it was on the smaller end of the scale. 2. They were nicknamed pocket battleships by the Western Allies. And 3. They replaced the Braunschweig-class battleships. Are these reasons good enough? Maybe, maybe not. But anyway, here's the episode. Political agenda and background. None. The sources that were used. Günter Kroschel, August Ludwig Evers, The German Fleet 1848 to 1945, Lose Eising Publishing House, Wilhelmshaven 1962, 3rd Revised Edition 1964. Hans-Jürgen Hansen, The Ships of the German Fleets 1848 to 1945, Bechtermünz Publishing House, Authorized Licensed Edition for Weltbild Publishing House, Augsburg 1998. Erich Räder, My Life, Volume 2, from 1935 to Spandau 1955, Schlichtenmeier Publishing House, Tübingen 1957. Caius Becker, The Kriegsmarine, Neuer Kaiser Publishing House, Klagenfurt 2004. Caius Becker, Damned Sea, Gerhard Stalling Publishing House, Oldenburg 1971. Janusz Pikalkiewicz, Naval Warfare 1939-45, Bechtermünz Publishing House, Authorized Licensed Edition for Weltbild Verlag, Augsburg 1998, and as usual, online sources as a supplement. Let's start with a provocative statement. Without the Treaty of Versailles, these ships would never have existed. The limits imposed by the Treaty of Versailles severely restricted German warship construction. I briefly touched on this in the last naval episode, episode 67, about the battleships of the Reichsmarine. Therefore, I'll just reiterate the key points. The Treaty of Versailles not only limited the number of ships Germany was allowed to possess, but also set rigid boundaries for when ships could be replaced by new builds and how heavy these new ships could be. In the case of battleships, 6 active ships plus 2 reserve ships were permitted, which had to remain in service for at least 20 years. New builds were limited to a maximum displacement of 10,000 tons. Since the German Navy only had old battleships of the Braunschweig and Deutschland classes at its disposal, which had been commissioned no later than 1908, theoretically all of these ships could have been replaced by new builds starting in 1928. However, 10,000 tons of displacement was less than that of these old pre-dreadnoughts, not to mention modern battleships. The British Revenge-class and the American Tennessee-class each displaced well over 30,000 tons. A 10,000-ton ship was more akin to a heavy cruiser under the rules of the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty. The Allies' objective was therefore clear. Germany should no longer have battleships, but only heavy cruisers. This would ensure that the German fleet remained permanently second-rate and would be unable to pose a threat to any of the contracting parties of the Washington Treaty. The German engineers accepted the challenge and strove to save as much weight as possible using modern manufacturing methods. Rivets and bolts were eliminated and welding was used extensively instead. Furthermore, aluminium was used instead of steel in the construction wherever possible. The goal was faster than anything that cannot be defeated, stronger than anything from which there is no escape. The armor was decent, but many of the auxiliary systems were not armored at all, a detail that would later prove fatal for the Admiral Graf Spee. Let's briefly review the technical details. The ships officially displaced 10,000 tons, but when fully loaded in wartime, this figure was closer to 14,300 tons. They were 186 meters long, just under 21 meters wide, and had a draft of just over 7 meters. 8 diesel engines propelled the ships to a maximum speed of 28 knots. Their range was approximately 19,000 kilometers at an average speed of 20 knots. This enabled the ships to serve as commerce raiders in the North and South Atlantic and to elude any battleship in the world. At the same time, their armament was more powerful than that of any cruiser or destroyer, from which they could not escape. The ship's armament consisted of 2 turrets, each with 3 28-centimeter guns, the same type of armament used by the battleships Gneisenau and Scharnhorst. The rate of fire was 2.5 rounds per minute, with a maximum range of 36.5 kilometers. The secondary armament comprised 8 15-centimeter guns, capable of firing up to 8 rounds per minute and with a range of 25.7 kilometers. Anti-aircraft defenses consisted of 3 88mm guns. The ship was also equipped with 8 533mm torpedo tubes. 2 Arado AR-196 catapult aircraft were also on board. These two-man aircraft had a range of approximately 1,000 kilometers and were armed with 2 20mm cannons, 2 7.92mm machine guns, and 2 50-kilogram bombs. Domestically, the construction of new major warships was controversial. The political left, especially the powerful Social Democratic Party SPD, rejected such a construction program. The Social Democrats were supported in this by the Communist Party KPD. The SPD preferred to invest Germany's limited financial resources in social projects and coined the slogan "For Children's Meals Against Armored Ship Construction." The project was supported by the military, the bourgeois parties, and the right-wing parties. The armored ship project was a key issue in the 1928 election campaign. After the election, a grand coalition was formed under the SPD Chancellor Hermann Müller. The construction of the new ships was a concession by the SPD to the bourgeois parties. Curiously, Admiral Raeder was initially against the construction of the ships. Becker writes on page 15 of his book about the Kriegsmarine, "Nevertheless, the very man who later desperately needed the pocket battleship for his own naval strategy in the war opposed the concept of the pocket battleship in the German Navy. Admiral Erich Raeder. At that time, as head of the Baltic Sea Naval Station, he favored the slow coastal tank, which would certainly have been better suited for a purely Baltic Sea war, for example against Russia or Poland. The Grand Coalition initially approved the construction of 1 ship. The government of Chancellor Heinrich Brüning then ordered 2 more ships in 1931. The flagship Deutschland was laid down in 1929 and launched in 1931. She was commissioned in April 1933. The Admiral Scheer was laid down in June 1931 and launched in April 1933. She was commissioned in November 1934. The Admiral Scheer was slightly wider than the Deutschland. However, she was somewhat lighter, with a maximum displacement of only 13,660 tons. Her range was only 16,900 kilometers due to a smaller fuel capacity. Her armor was slightly improved compared to the Deutschland. The Admiral Graf Spee was laid down in October 1932 and launched in June 1934. The ship was commissioned in January 1936. The Graf Spee was slightly wider and had a slightly deeper draft. Her maximum displacement was around 16,000 tons. The Graf Spee's engine power was never precisely measured, but she reached 29.5 knots, suggesting that her propulsion was by far the most powerful. Her armor was further strengthened compared to the Scheer. In 1936-37, the ship served as the flagship of the Kriegsmarine. A separate chapter could be written about the ship class designation. In Germany, they were initially called Panzerschiffe, meaning armored ships. From February 1940 onward, however, they were classified as Schwere Kreuzer, heavy cruisers. Abroad, due to their small size and considerable firepower, They were called Westentaschen-Schlachtschiffe, pocket battleships. As expected, the Allies of the First World War reacted negatively to the construction of the ships and attempted to halt it. Germany was prepared to stop construction if the naval provisions of the Treaty of Versailles were lifted and the country was allowed to accede to the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. This would have granted Germany a total tonnage of ships and integrated it into the naval armament regulations then in force. While the USA and Great Britain supported this, France rejected any amendment to the Treaty of Versailles. Germany therefore continued construction. And since the ships did not violate the Treaty of Versailles, the Allies could not prevent their construction. France responded by building its own new battleships, namely the Dunkirk-class. Ultimately, the British remained calm. In Becker's book on the Kriegsmarine, it says on page 19, "Moreover, the English judged more calmly. Even if 5 more, however brilliantly designed pocket battleships were to be built, the Times stated on February 19, 1930, the German fleet would remain far inferior to any of the naval powers party to the London Treaty." And that hit the nail on the head. The ships proved to be very seaworthy and quite maneuverable. Minor problems could be resolved through modifications. For example, the bows of the Admiral Scheer and the Deutschland were rebuilt in 1940 and 41. Furthermore, the initially meager anti-aircraft armament was continuously improved over the years. At first, the Admiral Scheer only had 3 individual 88mm anti-aircraft guns at its disposal. In 1945, there were 6 40mm guns, 8 37mm anti-aircraft guns, and 33 20mm guns. Let us now turn to the ship's active service, beginning with the pre-war period. As early as the early and mid-1930s, the ships were conducting exercises in their future combat zones in the North and South Atlantic. In 1936, a civil war broke out in Spain. The Republican government was primarily supported by the Western powers and the Soviet Union, while the insurgents under General Franco were backed by Germany and Italy. Officially, the major powers remained neutral in the war, but unofficially they supported their side with weapons and secretly with troops. The Deutschland-class warships were therefore also deployed in Spanish waters. From 1936 onward, the German pocket battleships Deutschland and Admiral Scheer patrolled Republican coastal waters to prevent foreign intervention. At the same time, German and foreign citizens were evacuated under the protection of the German warships. In May 1937, an incident occurred. During an air raid by Soviet SB-2 bombers, some of which were secretly flown by Soviet Air Force pilots, the battleship Deutschland was hit by 2 bombs. The explosions caused fires on board, 31 sailors died and 74 or 78 were wounded. The ship returned to Germany for repairs. Hitler ordered a retaliatory attack by the Admiral Scheer, which then bombarded the Republican port city of Almería. The ship fired approximately 200 rounds at the city. 19 or 21 people died, 55 were wounded, and 35 buildings were destroyed. The defensive shelling by Republican coastal batteries was inaccurate and missed the Scheer. Stalin subsequently ordered that Soviet aircraft were no longer allowed to bomb German or Italian ships. The Admiral Scheer was replaced by the Admiral Graf Spee in the summer of 1937. During the Battle of Malaga in 1937, the ship shelled the city. In 1938, the Graf Spee became the first ship in the Kriegsmarine to be equipped with a radar system, the FU-MG-38 Seetakt, which had a maximum range of 25 kilometers. From 1939 onward, all major warships of the Kriegsmarine were equipped with this radar. At the end of August 1939, before the outbreak of the Second World War, both the Deutschland and the Graf Spee set sail. They were intended to be in the operational area at the moment of the outbreak of war and thus no longer be subject to a British blockade. While the Deutschland was to remain south of Greenland, the Graf Spee was en route to the South Atlantic. Only the Scheer remained in Wilhelmshaven due to engine trouble. There, on September 4th, she was attacked by 10 British Blenheim bombers. 2 bombs exploded just beside the ship, one hit the ship but failed to explode. The Scheer remained undamaged and managed to shoot down 5 of the Blenheims. The pocket battleship was subsequently refitted, receiving among other things an improved bow, additional anti-aircraft guns and an upgraded radar system. She was not operational again until July 1940. The Deutschland, on the other hand, received orders for commerce raiding at the end of September 39. She was to engage British and French merchant ships according to prize regulations, meaning they were to be stopped, searched for war material, their crews evacuated, and only then was sinking permitted. Engagements with enemy naval units were to be avoided in order to maintain operational readiness. The Deutschland had been sailing south during September and was in the Azores area when the order arrived. She captured several freighters there, but was reported to the British Naval Command. Bad weather prevented her from operating as effectively as desired. However, she still tied down significant British and French forces that were needed in European waters. In November 39, she returned to Gotenhafen unmolested. There she was refitted, including the same new bow as the Admiral Scheer, and was not operational again until March 1940. At that time, the German ships had an advantage over the Royal Navy thanks to their Seetakt radar and could evade blocking vessels. Furthermore, British aerial reconnaissance was not yet as effective. From September to December 39, the Graf Spee operated successfully in the South Atlantic and also made a foray into the Indian Ocean near Madagascar. Numerous cargo ships were captured and sunk. Captain Langsdorff strictly adhered to prize regulations. The Graf Spee was reported several times by radio. The British and French naval forces therefore formed several task forces to hunt down and destroy the Graf Spee. These task forces included 4 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 1 battlecruiser and 16 cruisers. Battlecruisers like the Hood were particularly dangerous as they were both more powerful and faster than the pocket battleships, while battleships and cruisers were either more powerful or faster. The Graf Spee repeatedly confused her opponents with camouflage modifications, such as false funnels and gun turrets, that altered the ship's profile as well as with false names on the hull. At times, the ship sailed with the name Deutschland on one side and Admiral Scheer on the other. On December 12, the Graf Spee's Arado aircraft was irreparably damaged, rendering the ship incapable of aerial reconnaissance. On December 13th, off Montevideo, in the Rio de la Plata, the Graf Spee encountered elements of Force G, which was pursuing her. Their commander, Commodore Harwood, had ordered the heavy cruiser HMS Cumberland to the Falkland Islands. The other heavy cruiser, HMS Exeter, and the light cruisers HMS Ajax and HMS Achilles remained in the Rio de la Plata. The Graf Spee initially misidentified the group of ships, believing them to be the escort of a convoy. Then HMS Exeter was correctly identified, but the 2 light cruisers were initially mistaken for destroyers. Langsdorff knew that the British ships were faster than his own, so he closed the distance and attempted to destroy them quickly with his superior naval guns. The British, in turn, split their squadron to divide and weaken the German artillery fire. The Exeter was badly damaged during the engagement. Of her 6 203mm guns, only 1 remained operational, and several of her secondary guns were also out of service. She listed and could only manage 18 knots. 61 sailors were killed and 23 wounded. The Achilles sustained minor damage and suffered 4 dead and 1 wounded. The Ajax suffered moderate damage. Among other things, 2 gun turrets were knocked out. There were 7 dead and 5 wounded. The Graf Spee had sustained numerous hits and suffered 36 dead and 60 wounded. The damage was mostly minor. However, there were 4 serious problems. 1. The diesel oil purification plant had been damaged, making a return to Germany impossible. Instead, it was expected that the diesel engines would fail within a day. 2. The desalination plant and the galley were destroyed. It was no longer possible to supply the crew with food and water. 3. A leak in the bow had caused flooding. 4. A large portion of the ammunition had been expended in the engagement. A second engagement, like the one against Ajax, Achilles and Exeter, was no longer possible with the remaining ammunition. Admiral Raeder writes in his memoirs that in his opinion Captain Langsdorff made a mistake in accepting the engagement with the British cruisers. In doing so, he effectively relinquished his ship's greatest advantage, the superior range of its guns, and allowed the three cruisers to bombard him from three sides with 203 mm and 152 mm shells. Commodore Harwood had deliberately ordered his ships to attack like destroyers in order to confuse Langsdorff, and this aggressive tactic had worked. One can indeed characterize this decision of Langsdorff as a mistake. However, Langsdorff had demonstrated good leadership in previous engagements and also during the battle. He was therefore not a bad commander. It was simply that Harwood was better. He was better prepared and above all had the element of surprise on his side. The Graf Spee headed for the neutral port of Montevideo in Uruguay. The arrival of the pocket battleship was a media event, reported worldwide. The dead and wounded, as well as captured Allied merchant sailors, were brought ashore. Political pressure from the British embassy ensured that the Graf Spee was only allowed a 72-hour stay in port, after which internment loomed. The British had stationed only the two damaged light cruisers HMS Ajax and HMS Achilles off Montevideo. The heavy cruiser HMS Cumberland joined the group at short notice, but further reinforcements were thousands of kilometers away. The British successfully bluffed, however, that aircraft carriers and battleships were waiting for the Graf Spee off Montevideo. Langsdorff was left with only two options: an escape attempt, which he considered unlikely to succeed given the presumed strength of the enemy fleet, the condition of the engines, and the limited ammunition supply, or scuttling the ship. On December 18, 1939, a skeleton crew steered the ship into the mouth of the Rio de la Plata and scuttled it before the eyes of 20,000 spectators. The crew was interned in Uruguay, and many of the sailors remained in the country after the war. Captain Langsdorff took his own life on December 20, 1939, in a hotel in Buenos Aires. British specialists discovered remnants of the Seetag radar on the wreck of the Graf Spee, a shock to the British, as such advanced radar equipment was not scheduled to be installed in the Royal Navy until 1940-41. However, the report was more or less ignored as it was not considered credible. Ultimately, the German leadership was dissatisfied with Langsdorff's decision. His widow's pension was reduced, and 2 days after his death, Grand Admiral Raeder, Chief of the Navy, issued an order that German warships were henceforth to fight to the last man. In February 1940, the remaining ships, the Deutschland and the Admiral Scheer, were reclassified as heavy cruisers. The Deutschland was simultaneously renamed Lützow, as the Reich government feared that sinking a ship named Deutschland would be highly detrimental to its propaganda. The German pocket battleship Lützow participated in Operation Weserübung, the invasion of Norway, in April 1940. Along with the heavy cruiser Blücher and several other ships, the Lützow was to take part in the capture of Oslo. The Blücher led the flotilla and was sunk by artillery and torpedoes from the Norwegian Oscarsborg fortress. The Lützow was also hit and severely damaged. The forward gun turret, the ship's sickbay, and a shipboard aircraft were disabled, and a fire broke out on board. The ship suffered 6 dead and 25 wounded. The German flotilla was forced to withdraw and land its troops far from Oslo. The Lützow was able to use its aft 28 cm gun turret to support the landing forces. Oslo was occupied only after a delay, which allowed the Norwegian government and royal family to escape. The Lützow was ordered back to Germany for repairs. However, on the way she was intercepted and torpedoed by a British submarine. The Lützow was severely damaged in the stern. The stern more or less snapped off the hull and almost broke off completely. 1,300 tons of water flooded the ship, and there were 15 fatalities on board. The Lützow was fortunate, however, because the British submarine had no further torpedoes and was therefore unable to launch another attack. The powerless and unmaneuverable ship had to be towed into port. The repairs took approximately a year. The Lützow was not able to return to service until the end of March 1941. The Admiral Scheer, however, was able to embark on a commerce raiding patrol in October 1940. She operated in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans and sank several freighters. Once again, the Royal Navy assembled a large fleet to sink the German commerce raider. The Scheer, however, managed to evade the British ships. In April 1941, she returned to Germany. During this patrol, she had covered a total of 85,000 kilometers and sunk 17 freighters. Several British aircraft carriers and cruisers had unsuccessfully pursued her. This long patrol had only been possible thanks to the deployment of various German supply ships. During 1941, however, the Royal Navy was able to disable this supply network, making further patrols impossible. Furthermore, Allied air and radar surveillance had become so effective that a breakout of the large ships into the Atlantic, especially after the sinking of the Bismarck, could no longer be risked. Commerce raiding was taken over by submarines, especially after the heavy units Scharnhorst, Gneisenau and Prinz Eugen were recalled from France in February 1942. The armored ships now shuttled back and forth between the Baltic Sea and Norway. During its deployment to Norway in June 1941, the Lützow was attacked by British torpedo bombers and severely damaged. Repairs continued until early 1942. Several air raids against the Admiral Scheer in September 1941, however, were unsuccessful, and the ship was able to serve in Norway. In February 1942, the Admiral Scheer was transferred to northern Norway to engage the Allied convoys in the Arctic Ocean heading towards Murmansk in the Soviet Union. The Lützow joined this force in May 1942. During its operation in July 1942 against convoy PQ-17, the German Navy achieved its greatest success, albeit indirectly. News of an approaching German surface fleet led to the dispersal of the convoy. The individual ships were then pursued by U-boats and the Luftwaffe. The surface ships returned to port without encountering the enemy. During this operation, the Lützow ran aground in dense fog and was so badly damaged that it had to be repaired in Germany. In August 1942, the Scheer conducted a mission in northern Soviet waters. During this mission, an icebreaker was sunk. Two other ships as well as port facilities in Dixon were damaged. At the end of August 1942, the ship successfully returned to Narvik. The Scheer remained undamaged. However, the Navy had hoped for more from this mission. At the end of 1942, the ship returned to Germany and underwent a major overhaul in Wilhelmshaven. A Royal Air Force air raid slightly damaged the ship, which delayed the work and ultimately led to its relocation to Swinemünde. The Admiral Scheer remained with the training fleet in the Baltic Sea until the end of 1944 and saw no further combat. The Lützow was able to return to Norway in November 1942. At the end of December 1942, she participated in Operation Rainbow, another operation against the Allied Arctic convoys. The attacking German force consisted of the Lützow, the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, and several destroyers. However, the operation in heavy seas was unsuccessful. The Lützow's gunfire was inaccurate and neither the freighters nor the escort ships were damaged. The other German ships also had little success. Part of the blame for this failure lay with the tactical and technological superiority of the Allies, who by then possessed better radar systems and could therefore position themselves more effectively and fire accurately, even without direct line of sight. The meager results of this operation provoked a fury in Hitler, and he ordered all heavy surface vessels of the Kriegsmarine to be scrapped. Admiral Raeder subsequently resigned as Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine. The new Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Dönitz, was able to persuade Hitler to change his mind. While no new heavy surface vessels were built, the existing ships were saved from being scrapped. A plan to convert the Lützow and the Scheer into aircraft carriers was briefly discussed. The work would have taken approximately 2 years. However, this plan was ultimately abandoned. In March 1943, the Lützow had to return to Germany due to engine damage. Further repairs were necessary at the end of September 1943 and were not completed until January 1944. The ship then remained in the Baltic Sea. From late summer 1944 onward, both pocket battleships conducted coastal bombardments on the Eastern Front, including at Memel, Sworbe, Elbing and Danzig. In November 1944, the Admiral Scheer relieved the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, which had been supporting German units against Soviet forces on the Baltic island of Ösel. The Soviet Air Force attacked the German ships several times, but was repelled by heavy anti-aircraft fire. However, the Scheer's onboard aircraft was shot down. The Navy successfully evacuated approximately 4,400 soldiers from Ösel. In February 1945, the Scheer supported the Wehrmacht with coastal bombardments against the Red Army near Samland. The Navy's support enabled the Wehrmacht to launch a counterattack that briefly restored the land connection to Königsberg. In March 1945, the Scheer actually needed new gun barrels as hers were by then worn out. On her voyage to Kiel, she transported 800 civilians and 200 wounded soldiers. However, due to minefields, she could only travel as far as Swinemünde, where she disembarked the refugees. The replacement of the gun barrels therefore had to be postponed. She then supported German forces with coastal bombardments near Kolberg and Wollin until she had expended all her ammunition. The ship returned to Swinemünde, took on more refugees, and set course for Kiel. She successfully navigated the minefields and reached Kiel on March 18, 1945. Only then could her gun barrels be replaced. The Lützow was also repeatedly called upon for coastal bombardments in the spring of 1945. She was in constant action near Frauenburg, Elbing, Tolkemit, Danzig and Gotenhafen and only withdrew on April 8, 1945 due to a shortage of ammunition. On April 9, 1945, 300 Royal Air Force night bombers attacked the port of Kiel. The Admiral Scheer was badly damaged and capsized. On April 16th, the Lützow was severely damaged by the Royal Air Force with 6-ton tallboy bombs near Stettin and ran aground in shallow waters. The main deck was still 2 meters above the waterline, allowing the ship to be used as an artillery platform against the Soviet ground army. After all ammunition had been exhausted and the situation had become hopeless, the crew attempted to blow up the ship, but this failed because a fire broke out and rendered the explosive materials unusable. In the end, the ship was severely damaged and its main guns were rendered unusable, but it was not as destroyed as the Germans had hoped. What happened to the wrecks? The wreck of the Admiral Scheer was partially scrapped in Kiel harbor. However, part of the hull remained intact. Since the ship had capsized, mainly the lower part of the vessel was removed, meaning that most of the superstructure and the ship's artillery remained intact. The ship's berth was filled with rubble and debris from Kiel and after the war converted into port land. Parts of the Admiral Scheer therefore remain buried beneath the landward part of Kiel harbor to this day. The ship's bell is located in the German Naval Museum in Wilhelmshaven. The fate of the Lützow remained unclear for a long time. For a while it was believed that the ship had been raised by the Soviets and scrapped in the late 1940s. However, in the early 2000s, after reviewing Soviet archives, it was discovered that the ship had been raised and scuttled in July 1947 off Swinemünde during Soviet weapons tests. The Admiral Graf Spee sank in water only 11 meters deep and was partially scrapped in 1942-43. Further salvage operations did not begin until 1997, despite protests from the German government, which continues to consider the ship German property. Several objects, including guns, optical sights, as well as Reichsadler, imperial eagles, and swastikas were recovered and temporarily put on display. Because the ship sank in shallow waters, it poses a certain hazard to shipping. A few finishing words. The Deutschland-class armored ships were an attempt by the Weimar Republic's Navy to build powerful vessels within the strict confines of the Treaty of Versailles. While they could not match full-sized battleships, they were superior to heavy cruisers. The Deutschland-class ships were so powerful that they could not be defeated by cruisers, as clearly demonstrated in the duel between the Admiral Graf Spee and the Exeter, Ajax and Achilles. Their use as surface commerce raiders was successful at times, but ultimately ineffective. All the ships were only able to complete one patrol before being driven back into German waters or sunk by the overwhelming superiority of the Allied naval and air forces. The idea of operating far from home for extended periods, as the cruiser Emden had done in the First World War, was no longer viable and extremely risky in the face of aircraft and radar. Operations in the Arctic Ocean were also largely ineffective. It was not until 1944–45 that the ships were able to participate in operations in the Baltic Sea again. By then, however, defeat in the war could no longer be prevented. Thank you. This was History Lost in Time.